Thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. John Wagner to come and give our talk here. He's the Associate Lab Director for Nuclear Science and Technology Director at Idaho National Lab. One of the reasons I'm thrilled to have him here, though, is because a lot of his PhD work, his sort of big mark on the technical side of things, is the inspiration for 4 or 5 of my students' dissertation work. And so a lot of work he did in variance reduction for Monte Carlo stuff has really been the groundwork for things that we've got off and done, taken different directions, and extended that work. And so it's exciting to have him here. He's not going to talk much about that probably today, but that's good because he's also opening a series of seminars we have with Idaho National Lab. So the Institute for Nuclear Energy Systems here at UW has embarking on a new partnership with Idaho National Lab in this directorate. And so we've scheduled 4 or 5 additional seminars throughout the year. There's 2 more coming up this semester. One of them is coming up. I should have pulled those dates up, but one of them is coming up in the October 11th.
I think you have Boone coming to talk to you.
Beginning in October, and then Mark DeHart's coming in November. And so Boone's going to talk more about materials initiatives, and Mark DeHart's reactor physicist and part of the NEAMS program. He's going to talk about some of the work going on in NEAMS and things like that. So stay tuned for those future talks. But right now, then, I'll be happy to turn it over to John Wagner and have him give us an introduction to Idaho National Lab and set up those talks that are coming later in the year.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. And actually, it's nice of you to bring up the work in the variance reduction area. I really enjoyed that work and working with a number of your students on it. It feels a little bit like a lifetime ago, but really enjoyable work in that area. And again, enjoyed working with your students. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. Today will be not a detailed technical talk. This will be more of a high-level talk around the challenges and opportunities for nuclear energy. As Paul mentioned, perhaps kick off some perspective and understanding of Idaho National Laboratory and where nuclear energy is in general. And then colleagues will come and do some deep dives. And actually reminds me, just looking at this title slide, there's a lot of really cool opportunities actually for detailed seminars. Up in the upper left, that's a TRISO particle or TRISO pebble showing the different particles. We just completed all the irradiations in our TRISO fuel program. And by the way, the NRC just issued a safety evaluation report on a topical report that was submitted related to TRISO fuel performance. One of our researchers, Ruchi, down in the bottom or middle left, working in the glove box. She's one of our chemistry researchers in the fuel cycle area. In the middle there, you see our Marvel reactor concept. This is a 100 kilowatt reactor that we intend to take critical by the end of next fiscal year. And then, of course, you see some modeling and simulation results being visualized. And above that, you see human factors researchers working in our human system simulation laboratory, helping light water reactor modernization activities. So a lot of really cool things going on that are opportunities for maybe deeper discussions into. The way I've structured my talk with you all today is I'd like to give you a little bit of an introduction into INL. I'll try to keep it brief, but I think context matters. So I'm going to start there. And what is now the Idaho National Laboratory traces its origins all the way back to 1949 with the establishment of the National Reactor Testing Station. Actually, the origin of the site even goes back further for military applications with munitions. But for purposes of nuclear, I'll trace it back to 1949 for the National Reactor Testing Station. This was an incredible period of time, as I'm sure all of you know. And over the next couple of decades, there were many firsts and many reactors demonstrated. It was also a time period where people would design, construct, and operate a reactor in time frames of 1 to 2 to 3 years versus what we're used to right now. The first reactor on site was the experimental breeder reactor. The site was established, as I said, in 49. EBR-1 went critical and was operating in 1951. So over the next few decades, actually next really couple of decades, a lot of firsts occurred. The first nuclear power plant, the first U.S. city, that was Arco, Idaho, to be powered by nuclear energy. The naval reactors had a, well, it wasn't naval reactors back then. The Navy had a significant presence on the site from very early days. And the first submarine reactor was tested on the site. Reactors after that, operators trained, so on and so forth. The first mobile nuclear power plant for the Army was demonstrated on the site. The first fully self-sustained fuel cycle, that was with the experimental breeder reactor 2, was shown. And many of you are probably familiar with the seminal safety tests that were performed in the 80s with EBR2. And a lot of light water reactors, partly with with the presence of the Navy, but with the presence of many other companies like Westinghouse and General Electric. And really the basis for light water reactor safety was established out on the site. So maybe working with the loft data today as you're validating codes or what have you. This innovation, I think everybody knows, but people seem surprised when I say really all of this innovation in nuclear that happened over really only a couple of decades drove what the entire world does. At some point, the Navy selected light water reactor technology to move forward with. That had influence on other selections, and really, as you know, light water reactors became commercialized all over the world today, and by far the most prevalent nuclear energy generating system in the world. But as things kind of evolved in that way, there was less need for demonstration reactors, and a lot of commercial build out basically was going on. Think about 60s, 70s. And in 1994, the Clinton administration decided that we really did need to be investing in nuclear energy R&D. And what at the time was called the Idaho National Engineering Laboratory and the Argonne West laboratories were on the site at that point. The Idaho Nuclear Engineering Laboratory became Idaho Nuclear Engineering and Environmental Laboratory with a cleanup mission for the site. This is kind of the period of time where I would refer to the Idaho area, this site, as kind of the dark days, because they were starting to shut everything down. So in '94, the EBR2 reactor was shut down. The transient test reactor, you may know it as TREAT, was shut down, and the mission just shifted, completely to clean. Prior to 2005, various folks in Washington decided we really do need a nuclear energy-focused national laboratory, and started taking steps to form what is now the Idaho National Laboratory, which was formed in 2005. It was formed out of a merger of what was INEL and Argonne West, and it became the Idaho National Laboratory, and that's what it is today. So from the standpoint of its formation, the laboratory is actually not that old. From the standpoint of its history on the site, it's actually quite old. Then it took a little while. Actually, it was really great that INL was formed, but it took a little while to see budgets and actually activities and growth in nuclear energy research grow, which it has now done, and that's something I'm going to talk more about in just a moment. So before I go too much further into any of that, just finishing some discussions on the laboratory itself. So it's the site is 890 square miles. That's probably the most kind of surprising thing when I first moved out. By the way, I've been out at the laboratory a little over 4 years, and I came out to the laboratory with a singular focus. I want to build reactors, and this is the place to do it. So that's what drove me out here, and it's what drives a lot of what I do. So going back to the site, 890 square miles, there's multiple sites on the site. And so Materials and Fuels Complex is what used to be Argonne West, for those of you who might have some familiarity with it. There's the Advanced Test Reactor Complex. There's, I'm just looking at the same image you're looking at. There's the Idaho Nuclear Technology and Engineering Center, we call it INTEC. That's where actually all the naval fuel was reprocessed in the old days. They used to call it the chem plant. A lot of activities around recycling and reprocessing were done there. And of course, you see the Naval Reactors facility. This is a remote area, as you can imagine. It's Idaho, plus it's remote within Idaho. And that's why the site was selected originally for munitions testing and later nuclear energy testing. Today we operate 4 reactors. It's a far cry from the 52 that were demonstrated on the site over the years. We hope to watch that number move up in the near term. The number actually has increased in the last couple of years. Some of you may be aware that the TREAT transient test reactor I mentioned that was shut down in '94, we restarted that in 2017, and it's fully operational now. It was restarted largely to support the accident-tolerant fuels testing, but is now supporting testing for a lot of different advanced reactor concepts, as well as, including reactor concepts for NASA, by the way. Many of us work in Idaho Falls, which, if you look at that image of INL, is indicated there with the research and education campus. And so the rest of the site is to the west of the office buildings that people like myself generally are at. Because it's so large, we have rail lines, we have power grid, we have our own power station, we have a lot of different nuclear facilities. It's almost like its own state. In fact, it's a little smaller than Rhode Island. And so it's kind of a perfect place to demonstrate technologies at scale. I want to show you a little bit of what does it look like. This is actually the materials and fuels complex you're looking at now. That silver dome there is the old DBR2 containment dome, for example, and off to the west or to the left, that kind of whitish box, that's the transient test reactor. Looking out a little bit further west, this is the industrial complex. It's kind of hard, right in the middle, that silverish kind of rectangle, that's actually where ATR is. So anyway, hopefully that gives you a sense of what it looks like out there. It's what they call a high desert, but you won't find like big cactuses and so forth. You'll find sagebrush and stuff like that. Looking at the whole laboratory now, and then I'm going to focus, then I'll transition into more focus on nuclear. I lead the Nuclear Science and Technology Organization to the left, left hand on your screen. So we have a very strong focus, largely because of the infrastructure and the capabilities we have on nuclear fuels and materials. Nuclear systems and design and analysis, so think reactor design and analysis. Paul mentioned Mark DeHart is going to talk to you later this semester. He's in that division. Boone, by the way, who will talk to you in October, is in the Nuclear Fuels and Materials division. Then we have a very solid division related to fuel cycle science and technology. So think aqueous processing, pyroprocessing, spent fuel storage, transportation, and disposal. A division on nuclear safety and regulatory research. So the name is fairly self-explanatory, but think risk analysis, PRA, also human factors, and a lot of support for the current fleet. And then we have a division within nuclear science and technology called scientific computing. So think the MOOS tools, the MOOS framework, think visualization, AI, machine learning, and the hardware. So we recently added a 6 petaflop computer called Sawtooth to our stable. And we also created something called the Nuclear Computational Resource Center. So a single point of access for access to our high performance computing and our software. And maybe if there's questions, I can answer them. Everything that we do in nuclear science and technology is supported by the Advanced Test Reactor and the Materials and Fuels Complex. I actually started my career at INL a few years ago at the Materials and Fuels Complex as the chief scientist out there. It's really an amazing place with respect to, we have the materials out there to make fuels, we can make fuels, characterize fuels, remediate fuels and materials, and do all the post-radiation examination, all basically in one area. We don't just do nuclear at the laboratory, although it is the focus of the laboratory. We also support a variety of other energy needs, and particularly have strengths in transportation, biofuels, and the integration of intermittent sources with nuclear, for example. And then the lab's actually quite well known for cybersecurity, in particular control system cyber. But we also work with the National Homeland Security Directorate on nuclear non-proliferation, as well as physical security for nuclear and other systems. And they have a big emphasis on both cyber and physical security for critical infrastructure. So now I'm going to switch gears and really kind of go into the heart of the talk. And I use this slide for context. So there's a lot of studies out there about what's going on in terms of energy demand and temperatures, climate. So when you look through various studies, you can see variations, but largely credible organizations like the U.S. Energy Information Administration are predicting an increase in electricity, energy demand of 28% by 2040. That's only 2 decades. 28% increase in what we do currently in the globe. It's kind of staggering when you think about that level of increase. And then I'm sure you are all quite familiar with debates around greenhouse emissions and temperatures and so forth. But just about any study you look at is showing new rises in temperatures and predicting somewhere on the order of a 2.7 degree increase in atmospheric temperatures by 2040. Again, only 2 decades away. And while there's variations and differing opinions on how to reach our carbon reduction goal that many states, countries, and utilities are setting, there's pretty reasonable agreement that we can't do that without an expansion of nuclear energy. And so we really, if you step back, you look at this, really the expansion of nuclear energy is the fastest way that we're going, in the most effective way that we have available to meet that energy demand while not contributing to the increase in atmospheric temperatures. Currently, by the way, nuclear energy serves about 10% of the electricity in the globe, and that's about 450 reactors. And various organizations are indicating that needs to be at least tripled for nuclear, and nuclear needs to come up with 25% of the total electricity generation for the globe in order to address and achieve these carbon emission targets. So now I'm going to move into where we at on a few things, kind of to again lay some context before I get into what we're doing. And I'll move through these pretty quickly because I suspect they're pretty well known. Nuclear continues to be the most reliable energy source in America. Actually, the capacity factors are staggeringly good. Continues to be almost 60% of our zero carbon electricity. Nuclear energy generation actually peaked in 2018, despite the closures, and many reactors have already received their life extension for 20 years, and multiple plants are actually looking at extensions beyond the 60 years to 80 years, and actually 4 units have been approved for that. However, while that all sounds great, plants are shutting down, as you are, I'm sure, are aware of. And there's a variety of different studies. They generally have about 1/3 of our total reactors at risk. Generally, this is related to economic performance, particularly in deregulated parts of the country and parts of the country that have significant penetration of intermittent sources like wind and solar. For example, the plants in the Midwest are quite challenged economically. There are literally times in the day and in the year where they have to pay the grid to take their electricity. Not a very good business model. Multiple states have taken political actions to try to preserve and sustain their plants. I list a number of states there. However, what's happened recently, you see in Illinois and Ohio, kind of unrelated to anything nuclear technology, but related to accusations of corruption. Those actions are now being questioned. So we'll see how that plays out. Unfortunately, I have to update this slide on a regular basis. If I was talking to you 3 or 4 years ago, that 95 in the bottom right, 95 operating plants, was 104. That number continues to kick down, again, related to economic performance of the existing plants. And in areas not just where they're competing with wind and solar, but also competing with inexpensive natural gas. So that's the current fleet. However, this, as I mentioned, the interest in clean energy, particularly reducing carbon emissions, over the last several years has driven a very strong interest in nuclear, in particular in advanced nuclear. I'm happy to say today that we have really unprecedented bipartisan support for nuclear energy, whether and now as we face elections coming in November, both sides of the aisle are supportive of nuclear. They might have different reasons and different way they approach it, but I do expect continued favorable legislation and appropriations for nuclear energy research, regardless of the outcome in November. And over the last few years, we've really enjoyed a very significant increase in support by notable figures like Senator Murkowski, as well as increased appropriations for the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy budget, and really supportive legislation like the Nuclear Energy Innovation Capability Act, which by the way authorized the Versatile Test Reactor, authorized the National Reactor Innovation Center, and a few other things, including high performance computing for nuclear. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act was signed into law as well. It was more focused on regulatory reform. And there's another piece of legislation that has not been signed into law, but is present in various ways. Most recently, it got pulled, NELA, the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, got pulled into the Nuclear Defense Authorization Act, and may or may not come out of that and be approved later this fall. We'll have to see. There's a lot in NELA, and things like establishing a high-assay LEU reserve for advanced reactors, things like extending power purchase agreement, further authorization for versatile test reactors, etc. There's actually a lot in that legislation. It's very supportive for advanced reactors. So a lot of really positive things supporting advanced reactors over the last few years, and we hope to see that continue. The other piece that is important is waste. You can't talk about advanced reactors and deployment of advanced reactors without people asking you, what are we going to do about the waste? I don't have as much of an optimistic story there. I do have a lot of background on working spent fuel storage and transportation, and it's rather frustrating. I actually worked on the Yucca Mountain project, including contributing to the license application in 2008. But as you see the chronology in the lower right of the slide, not a lot of substantive progress, at least in terms of policy, has occurred. In fact, if I added 2020 to the bottom there, you'd actually see that the Trump administration didn't even ask for money for Yucca in 2020, as it's just become so politically difficult. But I do want to emphasize that while we have to have a solution for the waste, the spent fuel that we do have has continued to be safely and securely stored without incident at the generating sites. Not a long-term solution, but at least it is being managed effectively as of now until we are able to work out what we're going to do more long-term. Now I'd like to move into what's going on kind of in the research areas. I actually think about the priorities for nuclear in three different buckets, and that is, and you can see them in my previous slides really, the existing fleet, advanced reactors, and spent fuel cycle related research. So the punchline for the existing fleet is we have to make them more economically competitive for some of the reasons I've already indicated. And so our research portfolio is really focused on reducing costs and increasing revenue. We continue to have part of the research portfolio to support license extension, but actually that has gone quite well, both first extensions and subsequent license renewal. And so that's more of a kind of a continuation in material aging and degradation research, as opposed to a focus for sustaining the existing fleet. So then within the economic performance, again, I put it in two different areas. Areas focused on reducing costs. So think about capturing conservative margins, better modeling and simulation, reclassification of different components in terms of their safety, as well as risk assessments that help. Actually, the risk assessments really can help reclassify different components with regard to safety. And things like accident tolerant fuel, where you're looking at, and particularly the utilities are very interested in accident tolerant fuel concepts with slightly higher enrichments to reduce outage times and increase their operational cost performance. Another part of this that gets into a little bit of cost, but also sustainability, is modernization. These plants, many of them are actually quite old, 60 or so years old, well, 40 to 60, and so their control systems are outdated, obsolete, have difficulties replacing components and parts and so forth. And so there's a strong interest in modernization just for sustainability and obsolescence, but also for efficiencies, things like digital instrumentation and controls. Also, a big push in the utilities to reduce costs for maintenance and inspections through sensors and advanced technologies in terms of communications and sensors. So big focus basically in the current fleet on reducing costs and addressing obsolescence. We do some work as well when you look at the very far left of the part of the slide on attributes of the value of nuclear. Right now, a lot of the attributes of nuclear, the base load power, the grid support, the lack of carbon emissions, and so on, is not valued in the market. There's a lot of debate about valuation of that, and we perform technical analyses to support the data, the information for policy decisions. The other piece I mentioned that I'll dive a little deeper into is revenue. So a big part, one point a side of the coin is increasing your or reducing your costs. The other side is trying to increase your revenue. And for this, I speak about it that way in terms of integrated energy systems. And so this is, how do nuclear plants continue to generate revenue when they're up against intermittent sources and parts of the time where their energy isn't needed? And as I mentioned, you can have to pay the grid to take their energy. Well, you have to think about doing different things with your plants, of course. I'm sure many of you are familiar with load following and probably aware that many plants in this country do load following to a limited degree. But basically, it doesn't change your costs. It just maybe can prevent you from having to sell your energy at a very low amount or pay in the grid. What you'd really like to do is continue to operate the nuclear plant at full power and generate revenue off of the energy that you're generating. And this is what we largely talk about as integrated energy systems. Where today, looking at the left, it's completely electricity focused. We only provide, with a kind of minor exception of Diablo Canyon that does a limited amount of desalination. These plants are just generating electricity. That's all they're doing. Well, what if you did something different with that energy when the grid didn't need the electricity? And when wind and solar are peaking, what do you do with this extra energy? Well, that's really driven a lot of interest, even with the existing plants, in terms of other energy products that they could be using. In fact, I'm kind of excited now to say that we've got actual demonstration activities with Energy Harbor, Xcel Energy, Arizona Public Systems, and Exelon to demonstrate hydrogen production with their existing plants. Initially, just using the electricity for hydrogen production. The next stage would be using the heat to do hydrogen production. And hydrogen is just one thing you could be doing. There's a lot of other options. I mentioned desalination. You could be supplying other industrial needs and so forth. So I think this is kind of the first step into this space of using our current plants for something other than just electricity production, which will help them on the revenue side of the equation. And there's been a variety of cost analyses done, which is why these utilities are moving forward with these demonstration activities. So pretty exciting. I think years ago, I would have thought we were just going to do this with advanced reactors where you had higher temperatures. But again, out of a need to survive, the current fleet is pursuing these types of activities. And it's really necessary because the intermittent sources of energy are they're not going to go away. They're only going to increase. And we absolutely have to find effective ways for nuclear and these systems to work together. I'm doing a quick time check. I'll probably pick up the pace a little bit here. I know you're all familiar with nuclear reactors, so I'll run through this next set of slides pretty quickly. really the punchline is that there are different needs for, and different size reactors are needed for those different energy needs. Many in the world, and even within our nuclear energy community, when they think about nuclear reactors, they think about gigawatt scale plants. Plants like the Vogtle Summer plants that are being built right now down in Georgia, which is what the image there on the left is. Base load electricity 24/7, large footprint, roughly 10 years to build, roughly 10 billion plus per unit to build, and that's a great option for some parts of the world where you need a lot of energy. Maybe you don't have access to cheap natural gas. Even in the U.S., in the Southeast, it still is mostly economically viable to build these big plants. I say mostly because the cost overruns and schedule overruns have challenged that. But they have a role in certain parts of the country and in the world. But there are other parts of the country and the world where this is too much of a risk, too much of an investment, $10 billion per plant, and or too much energy for what they need all at once. And so other options are needed. This really was part of the emphasis for developing small modular reactors, reactor concepts like NuScale's reactor, which is a 12-pack, and which is an image shown here on the left. GE's X300 design, for example, Holtec. There's a variety of designs working in the, say, 60 to a couple hundred megawatt type size. Scale, by the way, that 12-pack is each 60 megawatt units that could be added on as they're needed, as the power is. A focus on trying to reduce costs through modular construction and other different construction techniques. And again, more flexibility in terms of adding in power as needed, as well as reducing the footprint, the land use that's required. In fact, the NuScale reactors that UAMPS is intending to build on the Idaho National Laboratory site, in addition to all the things I just said, also is looking at dry cooling. So and has a viable path to dry cooling. No external water source needed. And I'm sure you all are, I hope you're aware that the NRC just approved the design certification for NuScale, so that that technology is moving through the licensing process as well. So again, if you need kind of on the order of tens to hundreds of megawatts, small modular reactors might be the right fit. In recent years, I've become very, and by the way, I noticed there's a typo in this slide. I'm sorry. It's the first reactors are expected by 2029, not 2026. In recent years, a whole new need has, or really class of applications and needs has emerged. And I say this because actually, if you asked me 5 years ago what I thought about microreactors, I probably would have said, I don't know, what are you talking about? And that's how quickly things have changed. So my first exposure was remote communities in Alaska needing reliable power sources. This is areas of the country where they're completely reliant on diesel fuel, and diesel fuel being transported, it can only be transported in once or twice a year. So it's very expensive, it's dirty, and it's actually a risk in terms of people's lives and the energy they need to sustain their livelihood. And so the cost point is very different. Bottom line, the cost point is very different than large reactors. As these concepts started emerging and being seen as more viable, we saw a whole lot of other folks get interested in terms of things like remote mining. And anywhere you need power, reliable power in remote locations, military installations, space missions, desalination, disaster relief. I'm sorry, there's kind of a number of typos on these slides. Sorry about that. So it's really driven a lot of interest in these very small systems. And these are systems that I actually, there's not a clear definition. Sometimes you'll see megawatts or less used to define a microreactor. I think about it more in terms of can it be fully constructed in a factory and wholly shipped to wherever it needs to be and then installed. And many of the concepts, think about companies like Oklo, Holos, Holisgen and others are developing. Westinghouse is eVinci are developing these reactor concepts that are on the order of a few megawatts. And for remote communities, remote mining, some of those applications, that's exactly, there's a reason they're developing concepts of this size. It's to what's needed. So while we don't see a strong, what I'll call market pull for large reactors or even SMRs in this country, we see a very strong market pull for these microreactors currently. So with this strong interest in clean energy and in particular advanced nuclear technologies, it's created a whole lot of private companies in this space. And these are private companies that are trying to develop technologies, many of them reactor concepts, some of them fuels, so forth. But they struggled to figure out how to work with the national laboratories. There's 17 national laboratories, for example, by the way, and which national laboratory has what capabilities and so on and so forth. And to develop nuclear, you really need national laboratories if you're going to do any kind of a radiation testing or anything like that. Is it prohibitively expensive to develop your own test reactor in facilities? So I hope you're all familiar with GAIN, the Gateway for Accelerated Innovation in Nuclear, that was established in 2015. Basically be that front door to the national laboratory complex for private developers. But what I want to emphasize in this slide is the National Reactor Innovation Center. Signed into law, the NECA legislation authorized it, and then that was signed in 2018. In 2019, it was established. It was announced that it would be established, the Idaho National Laboratory. And so we've spent the last year, actually almost a year to the date, it was established in August of 2019, standing up the National Reactor Innovation Center to provide the capabilities for testing and demonstrating reactor concepts. And really working through those long lead time kind of activities that these reactor developers need to demonstrate their reactors. So I think high access to the fuel material, think access to fuel fabrication, the sites to demonstrate their reactors, the services, environmental assessments and so forth needed, and also operating authorities, both DOE and C, for these reactor demonstrations. So, and by the way, there's a thing I could mention related to the National Reactor Innovation Center. A webinar series has been started, and the first one is later today, actually. Paul, I can provide information on that if that's not readily available, but we can talk about that at the end. This slide is one of my, I'm getting towards the end. This slide is a key for me. And it's always been kind of a challenge of how do you get that advanced reactor, what I'll call pipeline, established, and how do we move from where we are today with no advanced reactors operating in this country to where we have a vibrant, successful advanced reactor demonstration and deployment. Don't forget deployment situation in this country and beyond. And to me, it largely driven by the fact that there's a clear market pull. It all starts with the demonstration of microreactors. Microreactors also offer, besides the market pull, offer some really significant advantages. And really, it's the opportunity to resolve key challenges, both in terms of demonstration and license, with a small, simple system, as opposed to starting out with a very large gigawatt scale system in comparison. There's all sorts of new markets available if we can demonstrate these systems. Think international cargo shipping, for example, and I can explain that maybe in the Q&A. But there's a lot of additional applications for small, reliable power sources. Provide some wins to build some momentum. We've not had a lot of wins in the press. In fact, the cancellation of the projects in South Carolina, depending on what news you read, the NuScale UAMPS project is in question about whether or not that's going to go forward. We continue to have a narrative around nuclear that it's they're being canceled, they're over budget, the timeline is extended, all these sorts of things. We need to flip that narrative, and I think that we can most certainly do that with these small reactors. And beyond the civilian needs of various applications that I've spoke to, there's a lot of federal applications, and so we're seeing a lot of activity on the federal government side. For example, Project Pele is a program to demonstrate a mobile nuclear power plant by 2024, we're directly supporting the Department of Defense Strategic Capabilities Office to do that right now. NASA has set targets to occupy the moon, and so they need what we call lunar surface power, a fission-based system for that, as well as to go to Mars. And so there's a lot of activity around nuclear thermal propulsion. Each of these activities from NASA has intentions to demonstrate a reactor on the Earth to demonstrate its functionality and operational before they launch one. And so we've got activities that are relatively new going on around both of those areas. So we see those demonstrations enabling deployment. I mentioned several companies are working to commercially deploy, talking to remote communities in Alaska, remote mining companies, and so on, including actually domestic military bases that are interested and have a need for reliable power, and also have their own carbon targets that they're trying to achieve. So I see by 2025 here at Idaho National Laboratory us demonstrating at least 2 new nuclear systems. That's our goal, and actually I think we might be able to do more than 2 depending on some of the private companies, investors, and their associated activities. Next, we need a fast spectrum testing reactor. We have not had one since the shutdown of FFTF, and so we're working hard to develop the versatile test reactor and demonstrate it somewhere in the 2026 to 2030 timeframe, depending on appropriated budget. And some of you may be aware that they just achieved critical decision 1 approval last week. Then also, you may or may not be aware that DOE and Congress in FY20 budget appropriated $230 million for an advanced reactor demonstration program. That program includes funding to demonstrate 2 advanced reactors within 5 to 7 years of award. The proposals, it also includes elements for risk reduction. So for companies who can't or not in a position to demonstrate in that time frame of 5 to 7 years, maybe it's 8 to 10 years, it also offers funding opportunities for them as well. And proposals for this opportunity were due August 19th. And they're being reviewed right now. In fact, DOE has said publicly that they expect the announcements for the 2 for demo to be made within October. So very soon we'll know the outcomes of those, and then the outcomes for the other opportunities that are, again, a little bit longer term will be known by the end of the calendar year. So this is, never in my career have I seen this kind of money appropriated for advanced reactors. It's just, again, in the old days, yes, but in my career, this is unprecedented. Then also, all of this stuff also supports a deployment of other larger reactors, including the SMR. I mentioned NuScale received design certification approval. They're working with a collection of utilities referred to as UAMPS to demonstrate commercial operation of their first unit in June of 2029. So when I look at all of this going on, we'll be sitting here in 2030 looking back at all the reactors that we now have operating and how this hopefully came together as at least somewhat similar to what I'm portraying here. It's hard to predict the future, but this is the path that we're trying to support. A key need for all of this is access to high-assay LEU. If you don't live in this world that I live in, you may not be familiar with this terminology. This refers to basically 5 to 20 weight% U-235 enriched material. So you probably know 20 weight% is a cutoff between low enriched uranium and high enriched uranium. Going into high enriched uranium puts you in a variety of different requirements and safeguards different safeguards category. So most reactor developers are not interested in going over 20 weight%. And yet they want the advantages of the higher enrichment. So most of them are developing their designs around just under 20 weight%. For example, 19.75%. But we don't have the material. So we have a couple different options we can use to generate the material. One is we have clean HEU stocks. you can downblend that to 28% and make that available. There's a limited amount of that material there that can and will be made available. But for the most part, there are other needs for that material. For example, supporting our nuclear navy, supporting our research reactors. But there's limited opportunity there. The opportunity that INL is supporting is recovering HE spent fuel, like the EBR2 fuel. We could recover it from ATR, potentially in the future, maybe even naval reactor fuel. So basically what you do is you separate the uranium out, and then you downblend that to high-assay LEU, and you clean it up as best you can to make that readily available for fuel fabrication. We are working on recovering 10 metric tons from the old EBR2 material right now, and have been making good progress. We've made that material accessible to the private reactor developers who want to demonstrate reactors, and are working with a company called Oklo to make 5 metric tons available for their first demonstration. Meanwhile, DOE is working to reestablish domestic enrichment capability. That's kind of the longer term path that's absolutely needed for these advanced reactors. And they have a contract with a company called Centrus to reestablish and demonstrate domestic enrichment. All these activities, can support in the near-term startup of advanced reactors, but we really need a significant domestic enrichment capability for a sustainable advanced reactor fleet. What more needs to be done? So a lot. We need to continue to work on policies to enable demand and actually deployment, including improvements to the licensing process, which there's a lot going on in that front right now, to NRC's credit, and some congressional push. Important things like emergency planning zone reform. Some of you may know the public comment period just expired last Friday with respect to rulemaking that the NRC is going forward to enable what I'll call right-sized emergency planning zones, not being arbitrarily large, but being appropriate for the level of risk and the technology being deployed. That is essential for small modular reactors and microreactors to be deployed without requirements for very large emergency planning zones. As one example, there's a lot of things going on. Public-private partnerships and demonstrations. I always say to enable advanced reactors, we must build one. We have to move forward with actually building reactors, and we're well on our way for that. I mentioned many private companies. I mentioned DOE-NE's Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program to support private companies. But actually, we have a lot of public partnerships in the works related to things like the DoD reactor, where we're working with 3 different private companies that are trying to support what DoD needs for their mobile nuclear power project. And just for example, that's Westinghouse, X-Energy, and BWXT. NASA is taking a similar approach, engaged in the private sector and the national laboratories to meet their needs. And then I mentioned supply and value chain a little bit when I talked about high-assay LEU, but the supply chain for much of what I'm talking about does not exist. We're working on it, but there's a lot of work to be done to support, particularly supply chain, and high-assay LEU happens to be one of the first and foremost things that needs to be addressed, but there are many others. Then this is my last slide, and most important, a lot of times I get asked, what are the biggest risks to some of these things that I'm talking about, particularly when I'm talking about the demonstration of advanced reactors, and it's really the people. We don't have enough people, enough high-quality people to do all these things that I'm talking about. It's my #1 risk to these different projects that we're talking about. Remember, I said we're going to demonstrate 2 reactors by 2025. Highly capable people, and it's not just demonstrating the reactors themselves. It's the modeling and simulation that's required to do it, both development and application tools. It's the fuels and materials development required, not just to demonstrate the reactors, but to demonstrate viable reactors that'll be cost effective to be deployed. It's the fuel cycle that needs to be developed around these different reactor concepts. It's kind of redundant on something I said already, but it's the irradiation testing and understanding the performance that is required for these systems for licensing and what have you. Risk assessments, emergency planning zone determinations. All of these all of these skills, all these technical skills are required to achieve these things. It's not just go build a reactor. And in some cases, it might be let's go build something that we know how to do, but chances are that's not going to be economically viable. That's a step towards what we need to do in order for these systems to actually be economically viable. In this very small area, this very small reactor area, we have an internal initiative called fission battery. And this is basically a goal of having small installed nuclear power systems that are completely autonomously controlled, that don't require any additional people around for physical security and things like that, that are installed and needed and support a variety of different energy needs, not just electricity, and are able to adjust to the energy demands of, say, a remote community or a military base. And there's a lot of R&D that's required to actually make from a concept or vision to an actual reality. And that's just one example of the things we're working on. So depending on where you're at in your career, I would encourage you to look at INL.gov careers for opportunities. Submit your resume, whether it's an internship, a postdoc. I know this is a shameless plug, but I'm going to do it anyway, Paul. Internships, postdocs, staff. If you go to our site and don't see a position that matches your skills, send us your resume. It's very much evolving. Positions are opening, they're closing, but it's a constant process. Just within my directorate, we have grown by 50% in the last 3 years, to give you some perspective, and I don't see that slowing down. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
All right, thanks a lot, John. And I'll also second the whole internship thing. We're part of our partnership with Idaho is to really collect some of our students' resumes and things and forward them on to Idaho as well as part of that process. So if you're interested in internship in Idaho National Lab in the summer, please let me know, and you can be in touch with me, and I'll help facilitate that process as well. We have a question. I thought we had a question yet, and I also put the link to the NREC webinar in the chat here. So if anyone's interested in that, they can go ahead and take a look. Mike Cordini has a question: is INL assisting Oklo in developing their safety case for the NRC, or are they simply providing a site and associated services for the eventual Oklo plant?
So for the most part, we did not, Mike. In fact, I think it's probably safe to say we did not support it, maybe at all. The work that we've done for Oklo to date has been helping them with fuel fabrication, casting, demonstrating that, and some testing around that, and then largely around the site and site services and approvals for being able to demonstrate the reactor on our site.
Any other questions? Another question: can you explain to the audience what the recent CD1 approval for VTR means?
Sure. So basically, and I'll do this in layman's terms, but to give you a little bit of context, any large DOE project has to follow a project management order, and so the DOE people, you'll hear them talk about DOE Order 413, and so basically this is just the project management approach that these projects have to follow. And then there are multiple kind of gates in this project as you start with mission need, that's critical decision 0, all the way to critical decision 4, and you've got whatever the thing is deployed. So and depending on, and then there's an implementation of this DOE order and in terms of what levels of requirements are needed. So for a project the size of Versatile Test Reactor, each one of these critical decisions requires the Secretary of Energy's approval. And I mentioned critical decision 0. That's basically establishing a mission need that the government's going to move forward with whatever this is. It's more than that, but that's kind of in a gist. That's what it is. You have to establish at that point a cost range and schedule, but it can be very uncertain. I mean, it can be a pretty large range. Then you move into critical decision 1, where you look at alternative options, and you also develop a conceptual design, and that helps you refine that cost range down. Well, refines it to a narrower range, as well as gets into schedule and different options for construction and so forth. So that actually, it's not just one thing. Actually, critical decision one, I think there's like 24 documents involved. It's largely around advancing the design, looking at other options, and then the DOE approving moving forward with the design that you've laid out at that point. It's actually a really big deal. I'm probably not. I don't know if I'm communicating what a big deal it is. There's not been any test reactors, advanced test reactors, that have had to go through this in the last couple of decades, and there's been several that have gone to CD0 but not to CD1. So it's a really big step. I will give you actually another piece of information related. Part of this has to be where you're going to get your fuel from and what is your fuel. So there was a lot of discussions in the critical decision one process about, can VTR really plan on using plutonium fuel, and where will that plutonium fuel come from? And so a lot of dialogue between DOE and NNSA regarding access to fuel material. So again, a refinement of the design and refinement of the cost and schedule.
Yeah, so what was the last one to get to CD0? Was maybe ANS?
I think it is ANS. I didn't confirm that, but I think ANS was the last one. And that
so ANS was a reactor plan for Oak Ridge called Advanced Neutron Source. It was probably 30 years ago.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was actually back when. Well, I'll date myself. It was a long time ago.
All right. Any final questions? All right, while I'm waiting to see if there's any final questions, I remind you that this is the first sort of teeing up a series of seminars from Idaho National Lab this year. We'll have Boone, I'm blanking his last name. What's his last name? Boone Beausoleil, right. Boone Beausoleil is going to be here in October talking about some of the advanced materials work going on. And Mark DeHart will be here in November talking about advanced modeling and simulation. And stay tuned for the spring seminars. We'll have a couple more folks from Idaho coming to talk about their work. If you are interested in internship at Idaho National Lab, please get in touch with me. And you will also need to go to their website and apply, but I can help you find the right places and facilitate that process. So please feel free to send me your resume and get in touch with me about that. And seeing no more questions, I'll thank you again, John, for that introduction, and look forward to
one
you
more
in person.
Comment,
yeah. Go ahead.
So just so people know, the internships, we're changing our approach on that. It used to be we would make decisions kind of early calendar year and even kind of late into the beginning of the calendar year. So January to March and even April. We found that we're not competitive when we do that. Most of the people have already decided where they're going. So our plan is to make all of our intern decisions by Christmas. It's not to say there won't be a few that are made later, but so if you're interested, please apply early so that you're considered in that mix.
Do you take students at any level?
Pardon me?
Do you take students at any level? If we have freshmen who want to do an internship, will you take them?
Yes. Yeah, okay. We have opportunities at all levels.
Great. Well, thanks again. Looks like we have more questions. So thanks for your time, and we'll see you again soon.
You bet. Good to see you, Paul. Take care.
Bye.